Good morning. Morning, everybody. How's everybody doing this morning? Good. Hope everybody's staying healthy. Matt, is that sarcasm or are you really having a blast? I figured. Having trouble sleeping? My sleep schedule is all shot. Is that why you're up, Matt? Okay. Anybody have any questions about the subject worksheet for tonight? You're basically giving me an overview of what your research question is and where you're going to go look for sources.
I am.
It also gives me a better idea to make sure you're focusing on a controversy. So if you're not, I can kind of head you off or maybe direct you in a better way so that you can get the resources that you need. All right, let's review what we talked about yesterday. So we talked about the 3 ways that you appeal to an audience, right? The classical approaches. So logos, which you guys are familiar with. What is logos? What are you using to appeal to the audience if you're using logos? Logic, facts, statistics, experts who've studied what their opinion is, right? All right, then what does pathos appeal to? Emotions, right? Hopefully, to our sense of community, the good emotions in us, ideally. Not always. I mean, sometimes you want to appeal to someone's sense of injustice or righteousness. Those are still good emotions, though, right? Yeah. And then ethos, which is the trickier one. And people definitely don't seem to always think about ethos and what kind of appeal is ethos. Also called the ethical appeal. Giving credit. Tell me more. Yeah, showing that you can support your claim, right?
Mm.
You can argue effectively. That you are trustworthy. You appeal to us with your character. We can say the author's character. Right? So I want to talk about today one of the ways, because it's more straightforward appealing to someone's logic with hard evidence and appealing to their emotions with stories or explanations that engage their emotions. The ethos appeal can be trickier, and sometimes people can disregard it. So one of the ways, and we started talking about this yesterday, that you can appeal to them is by addressing counter arguments. Okay, by showing them that you know your side of the issue, but you also know the other side, and you have answers for their concerns. Because the one thing you don't want is you don't want them to be reading your paper and something occurs to them that is against your argument, but you never say anything to set their mind at rest or show that you know that this might be a counter argument against yours. Okay. So we talked a little bit about two ways you can do that yesterday, right? You can refute their argument, which means tell us what's wrong with it. Okay. Or, and most people don't see this as a strength, but it really is, you can acknowledge, right, that the other side has a point. Have you guys ever heard the expression getting out in front of a story? Does anybody know what that means? Sometimes a politician will do this if they know some negative information is coming out about them. How will they get out in front of the story? Anybody know? Yeah. So before anybody can bring out the negative allegations about them, they will address them first. So before the reporter can break a negative story, they'll like have a news conference or a press conference and come out and basically get ahead of it by presenting their side of the story before. So instead of reacting to whatever's happening, they are being proactive and presenting their sort of response before anybody else can frame it. They're framing their reaction, okay, or their explanation, okay, perhaps acknowledging something they did wrong and then explaining why they did it. Okay, so let's talk about. I want to show you guys a short little video about dealing with counter arguments and some different techniques. Second, and I'll share my screen with you.
anticlimactic rap battle at the end when the protagonist, Jimmy B. Rabbit Smith, takes on the film's antagonist, Papa Doc. B. Rabbit raps first, and his strategy is to bring up and address everything that Papa Doc plans to say about him before he has the chance to do so. By doing so, when it's Papa Doc's turn to talk, he has nothing to say. The counter-argument is the section of your essay which enables you to employ this very same technique. For many people, the most challenging part of a counterargument is deciding what counterclaim or counterclaims to address. A counterclaim is something that people who hold the opposite position of yours would argue against you. You don't want to argue weak counterclaims or misrepresentations of your opponent's actual positions. Doing so is called a straw man fallacy, and it makes your position much weaker than what it does when you argue against a high-quality counterclaim. It's difficult but very effective to put yourself in the shoes of your opponent and think about what's wrong with your arguments or what arguments they might present against you. In a verbal argument, people can present points back and forth, but with writing, you only get one chance to address all potential backlash that could come your way. So you have to think carefully about those possibilities and narrow it down to one or two of the best counterclaims. Once you've picked a counterclaim or two, there are a couple of different ways to address them. You could use logical explanations or other reliable evidence to explain why the counterclaim is wrong or invalid. You might also acknowledge the counterclaim as a good point, but explain why it's not a good enough reason to change your position on the issue. Perhaps it's only one good point while your side has multiple good points that are equally valid. Or perhaps one of the arguments you presented is much stronger than the reason provided in the best counterclaim you could conceive. In the example provided, you'll see that the most popular reasons for making seatbelts a legal requirement are acknowledged by the author, but the author explains the flaws and the reasoning that come with it. If the author believed that the opposition's best counterclaims were logically sound, he or she could acknowledge that before explaining why, even though they are logically sound, they are not good enough reasons to trump the reasons for the author's position. An example of that kind of counterargument can be seen here. Once you've examined the different examples of counterargument, experiment with writing some of your own counterarguments for persuasive or argumentative issues that you have written, talked, or argued about before.
Okay, so let's take a look at the rap battle that they're talking about with Eminem. This is the last section of it. So he says he basically is going to address what he thinks is coming at him. Let's see how he does it.
Now everybody from the 313, put your motherfucking hands up and follow me. Everybody from the 313, put your motherfucking hands up. Look. Now while he stands up, notice that this man did not have his hands up. The free world got you gassed up. Now who's afraid of the big bad boy? 1, 2, 3 into the 4. 1 pop, 2 pop, 3 pop, 4 pop, 3 pop, 2 pop, 1, your pop, each pop, no pop, none. This guy ain't no motherfucking MC. I know everything he's got to say against me. I am white. I am a fucking mom. I do live in a trailer with my mom. My boy Future original good time. I do got a dumb friend named Cheddar Bob who shoots himself in his leg with his own gun. I did get jumped by all 6 of you drunk. And we did fuck my girl. I'm still standing here tweeting fuck the free world. So never try to judge me through. You don't know what the fuck I've been through. But I know something about you. You went to Cranbrook. That's a private school. What's the matter, dog? You embarrassed? This guy's a gangster. His real name is Clarence. And Clarence is the home of Clark parents. And Clarence parents have a real good marriage. This guy don't want to battle. He's shook. There ain't no such thing as halfway crook. He's scared to death. He's scared to look at his fucking yearbook. Fuck Cranbrook. Fuck a beat. I go out capella. Fuck a Papa Doc. Fuck a clock. Fuck a trailer. Fuck everybody. Fuck y'all if you doubt me. I'm a piece of fucking white trash. I say it proudly. Fuck this battle. I don't want to win. I'm outie. Here, tell these people something they don't know about me.
Okay. Clarence is a bum. So how does he address the counter arguments that he knows are coming and get out ahead of it? He puts all of his points into his rap. He says he doesn't want to win, you know. But he goes through a big list of things that he thinks his opponent's going to say about him, right? Okay, so he basically acknowledges a lot of it's true. That's one of the things that we've been talking about that you can do with your opposition, right? Does it make him look weaker? Just because he acknowledged they have some points? No, so it didn't hurt him to actually acknowledge, you know, some things that were wrong with, you know, his rep or whatever they were going to go against him for. Then what did he do? After he acknowledges all of the arguments they're going to have about him, he switches over to refuting the other side's argument, right? So what kind of evidence or arguments does he present to refute the idea that he's not as worthy to be up there rapping as Clarence is? What does he say against Clarence? Yeah, he's been basically he has a more, traditional reputation than Eminem does, right? He went to a private school, he lives with his parents, both parents, right? He doesn't have the credibility to be rapping about difficulties in life because his life doesn't sound all that difficult, right? So, was it effective? Would you say he won the argument that he was going for? He sure looks like he came out on top. You know, what does the other guy say? He's already been through all the stuff he could use against him, right? So it's a pretty devastating refutation, and it works pretty well to give him credibility, right? And to refute the other side. So he essentially does both. All right, one more video idea I want to show you, because a lot of times when I go over this, people, now they introduced another, we're collecting our logical fallacies, right? What kind of logical fallacies have we talked about so far? You don't have to name them by the specific name, but you can give me the idea behind them. What makes them bad arguments or logically flawed? What are the bad arguments we've talked about? Yeah, basically, if you destroy your ethos, appealing to just because everybody likes it, right? This is also called, they called it argument ad populum in the video yesterday, right? But it's also called bandwagon. You guys ever heard the term bandwagon? Like jump on the bandwagon. That means because everybody else believes it, you should believe it too, which is not generally a good argument because sometimes the majority of people are wrong. Sometimes they're right. Okay, but just the fact that a large group of people believe something is not an argument. Okay, there has to be evidence. Ad hominem, right, which is attacking a person's character instead of arguing the argument. Name calling, mudslinging, calling them a hypocrite, the tu quoque argument. You can't talk about the environment because you ride in an airplane. That's one I see a lot. Okay. The arguments that say that the environment needs addressing are not, wiped out just by the fact that that the opposition does something that you consider to be against the environment. It's part of trying to get you not to like them. So what is the logical fallacy he was talking about in the video? Anybody remember the picture? This one is specific to opposition arguments, and it's called straw man. And basically what it involves is instead of addressing legitimate arguments against your side, you either misinterpret what the other side is saying and find an argument that's really easy to knock down. Okay, instead of addressing the real opposition, you come up with a flimsy mischaracterization of the opposition and instead deal with that. So you'll exaggerate their position to say they want to take away everyone's cars. Instead of saying they want to reduce emissions, you're like, oh, they want to take away all of our cars. So you take the argument and you make it an easier argument to knock down. Okay, so you don't want to do that. You want to address the real opposition to your argument. Let's look at this other video.
When you're trying to persuade someone of something in a persuasive essay or debate, you generally want to give facts and arguments that agree with your position, of course. But to be really effective, you need to give some of the opposing side's arguments too. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but let me give you an example. In his well-known letter from Birmingham jail, this guy, you may have heard of him, responds to these 8 Alabama religious leaders who published a letter saying his actions protesting segregation were, quote, extreme, unquote. First, he argues that his protests are not extreme, but then he changes to a different tactic. He says, yes, maybe in a way, you're right, I am an extremist. At that point, you might imagine his reader thinking, wait, what? You think I'm right?
But Dr. King goes on to compare himself to other extremists they will have heard of: Jesus, Amos, Paul, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, great reformers from the Bible and American history. Remember, Dr. King is a Baptist minister writing to other Judeo-Christian religious leaders, so these religious references are part of a domain that they share. He reminds these clergymen that Jesus was an extremist for love, truth, and goodness. What he did there was respond to an attack by agreeing briefly with the opponent. It makes the attacker relax his oppositional stance for a moment. And then Dr. King comes back with a devastating rebuttal that his reader couldn't possibly disagree with. It was brilliant. You may have heard of the three ways the ancient Greeks said you can try to persuade someone: ethos, logos, and pathos. That's a whole other topic, but briefly, logos is logical reasoning, showing cause and effect. And pathos is an appeal to emotions like pity, patriotism, or indignation. Ethos is a little harder to get a handle on, but it can be understood as credibility. Why should your reader trust you? You need to come across as a knowledgeable, reasonable, and fair-minded person, not a fanatic who only sees things in black and white terms, good and evil. That's where the counter-argument or counterclaim comes in. By showing that you understand what this issue looks like from where your opponents are standing, you disarm them. You come over to your opponent's side for a moment and show yourself to be open-minded and fair. You admit that your opponents have a reasonable position and you can understand why they think what they do. But your argument is just more right than theirs, and you forcefully explain why. That's a rebuttal. Look at this question. So let's say your position is that violent video games do not cause young people to be more violent. Your reader or opponent is going to say that they do, and your job is to convince that person to agree with you. First, you're going to thoroughly research the issue and line up your most persuasive arguments. You're going to point out that sales of violent video games are up, but that violent crime by young people is actually down 37%. And if the games were causing violence, then wouldn't the violent crimes go up when the sales of the violent games went up? You're also going to cite the 2011 U.S. Supreme Court decision in which the court rejected arguments that the games caused minors to act violently. And you'll continue with more evidence and arguments that support your position. But at some point in your arguments, not in the first paragraph or the conclusion, I think, you should talk about your opponent's most persuasive argument. You're anticipating your reader's objections and addressing them. That's the counter-argument. Do your research. What is the opposition's most persuasive argument? Where are you vulnerable? Don't choose an easy one because it's easy to knock down. That's called a straw man. See, it'd be easy to knock this right over. Choose one that could actually hurt your position. Let's say that you think the most damaging argument the opposition has is that a lot of qualified people think that violent video games cause aggression in children. 90% of pediatricians believe that. 67% of parents think so too. And maybe most persuasively, and I got this from procon.org, a joint statement was put out by 6 national medical associations, including the American Medical Association and the American Psychological Association. And it said, quote, well over 1,000 studies, including reports from the Surgeon General's Office, the National Institute of Mental Health, and numerous studies conducted by leading figures within our medical and public health organizations, point overwhelmingly to a causal connection between media violence and aggressive behavior in some children. That one could hurt you, right? If you were arguing the other side, you'd use that, wouldn't you? I would. Don't avoid that argument. Doing so leaves you defenseless to it. Cite that argument yourself. Put it out there. And I'm not talking about a single sentence either.
Get out ahead of
Explain
it.
Fully and fairly. But then, respond to it in a way that is favorable to your argument. If you can contradict that or show a flaw in it, then do so. That's your rebuttal. You might say that there are equally valid reports showing the opposite, and then cite those studies. Not only that, a report by a Dr. Ferguson of Stetson University showed that many of those studies don't really reflect the the way the games are played in real life. And the ways that test subjects showed aggression are artificial measures that, again, are not a reflection of real life behavior. And then you go into great and persuasive detail to show that those flawed studies aren't worth the paper they're printed on. A rebuttal takes your opponent's best argument away from them, and it invites them to come on over to your side to consider your position as well. If you can't contradict, though, just give them that point. That's called a concession. It's like saying, okay, I'll give you that one. And then you undermine it as best you can. You try to weaken it. You might say, yes, there may be some causal connection with some children between the games and violence, but there are other kinds of things that can cause aggressive behavior, so maybe we should look at this in that larger context. Then give a long list of other things that are cited as possible causes of violent behavior. People used to say that heavy metal and rap music incited violence. Maybe you can find an article saying that watching contact sports on TV is connected to aggression too, or an article saying that caffeine is linked to aggression. You could point out that people are using your opponent's arguments to ban violent video games. And should we next try to ban rap music, football, and coffee? Okay, notice how I changed the subject there. When you concede a point, you could try this. You could try redirecting the discussion to an area where you have
sometimes your readers notice that, though.
Last, let's talk about transitions. You probably already know a thing or two about paragraph transitions. If not, check out my other video on that topic. But before giving your reader your counter-argument, you have to indicate that you're about to do that so that your reader is following your reasoning without getting confused. So you can use a transition like one of these. For example, you could say, people who say violent video games cause violence in real life might point out that, or while it...
I see this a lot. Sometimes it can seem like you're arguing one thing in your paper and then suddenly you switch to arguing the other side because you haven't given us a transition that talks about it's not your opinion now, that you are now addressing the opposition. So you might say something like one of these transitions. On the other hand, some experts believe. So make sure that you're clear in your transition, that you're switching not to now advocating a different position, but that you're addressing it in order to deal with it, explain it, say what you need to say about refuting or acknowledging it.
It's true that a joint statement by 6 leading medical associations said, or granted, there is some evidence suggesting a connection between violent video games and violent behavior. And then you give your counter-argument. Then after that, your rebuttal could be preceded with another transition, like, so while it's true that some children are affected by some video games, it's equally true that, or nevertheless, or nobody denies that some kids might behave violently after 8 hours of Mortal Kombat, but, and then you give your rebuttal. Using a counter-argument and rebuttal is a way of showing that you have come to your position after giving a balanced analysis of both sides.
Helps your
And that's
ethos.
more persuasive than just ranting from a single perspective. There's already too much of that in the world. Just look at the comment sections to videos and articles on the internet, and you'll see what one-sided argumentation looks like. And those arguments are easily dismissed, right? So don't be like them. If you want to be persuasive, come across as fair and reasonable. The best way to do this is by using counter arguments.
Okay. So, one of the things you want to remember is if you do not address the opposition in the paper, then half your argument is missing. Okay, so this includes when you're doing your research for your paper. So hopefully now that you did the last paper and you kind of have an overview of the issue that you're going to talk about, you might be leaning one way or the other. So give me one argument from your paper. We won't have time to finish this today, but we'll do some more on Monday. Give me one argument that you need to counter. One counter argument you need to address in your paper. I'm going to ask everyone for one, and we can kind of play devil's advocate for you, which means we'll help you come up with responses to the things we have to say. Anyone want to throw one out there? Kobe, what's your issue? Anybody else have a kind of argument they're going to have to address? Just one. Okay, so using hormone therapy in athletes who want to compete as the opposite of the gender that they were born as. Is that what you're saying, Mary? So are they saying the hormone therapy creates an equalization in the physical characteristics, basically? So if the athlete gets hormone therapy, then they become physically more male or female? Okay. And so the opposition is going to say, well, let's just say we'll take, because generally male and female sports are segregated because males have more muscle mass, you know. So is it enough? I would be like, if I'm arguing against you, is the hormone therapy enough to equalize the advantages that an athlete who is born male but is competing female, who identifies as female, is it enough to equalize the advantage they have? So we could say, point out the ways that it is, point out and acknowledge any ways that it may not be. They may have tests they can perform to validate whatever it is they're talking about. So yeah, that would be an interesting one to look at, like what do the studies show in terms of what kind of muscle mass or frame or, you know, advantages are still there after the hormone therapy, right? This is true. We tried prohibition, much in the way we tried marijuana banning, right? So even though it might, and actually alcohol does cause a lot more problems than marijuana does, and is still legal. So then you'd have to deal with the fact that maybe we just aren't able to ban it. All right, we are running out of time. So on Monday, bring an argument that you think that your audience is going to, it's going to come up when they're reading your paper and they're going to say, what about this? And you're going to have to address the counter argument. And we'll talk more about that. Remember, tonight the subject worksheet is due. I'll be online for a couple hours after class if you want to email me any questions. Otherwise, I will see you guys Monday. Have a good weekend.